December 24, 1944. Camp Forest, Tennessee. The scent hit first, not coal smoke, not damp wool or the metallic tang of unwashed bodies crowded into a barracks. Something else, something rich and sweet and utterly alien. Il stood near the barracks door, her hand resting on the rough wood, feeling the vibration of a truck rumbling past on the frozen mud road. The air that slipped through the cracks was cold, but it carried this impossible smell, a ghost of a memory. Her grandmother's kitchen, years ago, before the war, before the rationing. But this was stronger, more complex. It was cinnamon, yes, but also a deep, savory aroma of roasting meat, something on a scale her memory couldn't produce. A fragrance of impossible plenty. Other women noticed it too. A hush fell over the low chatter in the barracks, heads lifted from mending worn socks or reading tattered books. Eyes met across the cramped space, sharing a silent question. This was a place of rules, of routine, a world stripped down to essentials: roll call, work details, meager meals, sleep. Sensation was muted, rationed like everything else. The primary flavors were boiled potato and thin cabbage soup. The primary smells were lye soap and winter damp. This new scent was a violation. It didn't belong. Geisler, who still believed, who still scanned the skies for Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes that would never appear, felt a knot of suspicion tighten in her stomach. She saw it as a trick, a psychological torment designed to break them. She walked to the small, grimy windowpane, rubbing a clear patch with the heel of her hand. Outside, the landscape was skeletal. Bare trees clawed at a low, grey sky. The perimeter fence, a stark geometry of wire and wood, stretched into the distance. But then she saw it. An American guard, a boy no older than her brother, walking from the mess hall toward the officers' quarters. He was carrying a tray. And on that tray, steam rising from it like a dream, was a bird. A whole roasted bird, its skin a perfect, burnished brown. Beside it sat a bowl of something white and fluffy, and a small boat of dark, glistening gravy. Geisler's breath fogged the glass. It wasn't a trick. It was real. The sheer, undeniable reality of it was more confusing than any lie. Behind her, a woman named Marguerite, who had worked in logistics for the Wehrmacht and still thought in terms of manifests and shipping weights, mentally calculated the resources required. The fuel for the ovens, the manpower, the bird itself, a turkey, she realized with a jolt, a creature of pure luxury. To expend such resources on a single meal on this day, in this place, it was illogical. It was waste on a scale that felt like a new kind of weapon. The women didn't speak. They just stood or sat, suspended in this cloud of unbelievable aroma, each processing the sensory data through her own filter of memory, cynicism, or cold, hard logic. The smell promised something, but what it promised was so far outside the bounds of their constrained reality that it felt more like a threat than a gift. The sun was setting, the light fading to a bruised purple over the Tennessee hills. And the soft, open loop of the question hung in the air, more potent than the scent itself. What was about to happen? From that single, fragrant puzzle, the frame widens. The women in Barracks 12 at Camp Forest were not a random assortment. They were a specific consequence of a specific moment in the war. Most were Helferinnen des Heers female auxiliaries of the German army. Signals operators, administrative clerks, anti-aircraft support staff, nurses. They had been captured months earlier, swept up in the chaotic collapse of the German front in France following the Normandy invasion. They weren't hardened frontline soldiers. They were the women who had made the vast German war machine function, the cogs and gears of its immense bureaucracy. Their war had been one of radio headsets, typewriters, and supply ledgers, until suddenly it became one of panicked retreats, and finally, the raised hands of surrender. Now they were here. Prisoners of war, number 426, among more than 500 camps that dotted the American landscape, from the pine forests of the north to the cotton fields of the deep south. They were a tiny fraction of the over 425,000 Axis prisoners held on American soil by the war's end, a vast, invisible army living in a parallel nation governed by a different set of rules. The system that held them was immense, impersonal, and anchored in a document most of them had never read, the 1929 Geneva Convention. For the women inside the wire, the stakes were immediate and personal. Survival was a given. The camps were not extermination centers, but the real battle was against a creeping, corrosive despair. The uncertainty was a constant ache. Were their families alive? Were their homes still standing? When would this end? They scanned the faces of their American captors for clues, but found mostly a kind of bored professionalism. The guards were often young men, too green or too old for combat, and they moved with a casual lack of urgency that was itself a form of psychological pressure. For the United States, the stakes were different, more abstract. There was the logistical challenge of housing and feeding a population the size of Cincinnati. There was the strategic imperative to abide by the Geneva Convention, in part to ensure humane treatment for Allied prisoners in German hands. And perhaps there was the silent, secondary objective of demonstrating a particular kind of power, not just the power to defeat an enemy on the battlefield, but the power to overwhelm them with simple, undeniable material superiority. The women felt this power not in the guards' rifles, but in the thickness of their wool coats, the sturdy soles of their boots, the way they casually tossed aside a half-eaten apple. These were the small, constant reminders of a world of surplus they had long forgotten. So when the scent of Christmas dinner wafted into their barracks, it was more than just a smell. It was a signal, a data point that didn't fit the established pattern. Their conversations, which usually revolved around rumors from home or complaints about the work details, now centered on this new anomaly. Annalise, a nurse, heard the younger women whispering. Was it a special holiday for the Americans? Was the food only for the guards? Geisler's theory of a cruel trick gained traction. Maybe they would be made to watch the guards eat. That seemed more in line with her understanding of the world, a world of clear hierarchies and deliberate humiliations. The alternative, that the food might be for them, was too bizarre to contemplate. It violated the fundamental logic of captivity. The contrast began to crystallize, staging a silent battle between memory and present reality. On one side was the remembered Christmas of wartime Germany. On the other, the sensory evidence of Christmas in an American prison camp. The first and most profound point of opposition was the food. A German Christmas in 1944 was an exercise in culinary fiction. A family celebration was dictated by the stern arithmetic of the ration card. The festive meal might be a few thin slices of sausage, perhaps a treasured spoonful of preserved fruit and potatoes, always potatoes. Bread was cut with sawdust. Coffee was brewed from roasted acorns. A child's treat was a single hoarded apple. One woman, a former clerk from Hamburg, closed her eyes and could perfectly recall the taste of *Ersatskaffee*, its bitter, earthy flavor, a daily reminder of deprivation. She remembered the gnawing, low-grade hunger that was the background noise of life. The official civilian ration had shrunk to under 1,500 calories a day, a slow, grinding starvation. Against this memory, the scent from the mess hall was an assault. It wasn't just turkey. It was the smell of real butter, melted over mashed potatoes, the ghost of sage and thyme from the stuffing, the sharp sweetness of cranberry, the mellow, earthy promise of pumpkin pie. It was the smell of over 3,000 calories, the daily allotment for a non-combat American soldier, an amount mandated by the same rules for the prisoners in their care. The contrast extended to light and warmth. In her blacked-out city, Christmas would have been celebrated in near darkness, with heavy blankets tacked over windows to hide even the faintest glimmer of candlelight from the bombers that hunted the skies. Fuel was rationed as strictly as food. Families would huddle together in a single room, wearing their coats indoors to fight off the bone-deep chill. Here in Camp Forest, the barracks were heated, not to a sweltering degree, but enough to keep the cold at bay. And through the windows, the women could see strings of colored lights on a tree near the main administrative building. Electric lights, burning with an abandon that felt almost criminal. The soundscape was just as jarring. A German Christmas night was silent, but it was a heavy, fearful silence, punctuated by the wail of an air raid siren. Any music would be the crackle of state propaganda from the Volksempfänger*, the People's Radio, broadcasting speeches and martial music. In the camp, the women heard something entirely different through the mess hall walls. A phonograph was playing. A man's voice, a smooth American baritone, was singing about a white Christmas. The casual cheerfulness of the melody was deeply unsettling. The final contrast lay in the simple materials of the season. A German family might risk a small fir branch, decorated with ornaments carved from wood or folded from old paper. Here, the tree by the admin building was a full, perfectly shaped pine, adorned with glass balls and shimmering tinsel, products of a factory somewhere that was, impossibly, still making trivialities like tinsel in the fourth year of a world war. A woman in the barracks remembered her little boy, back in Cologne, being thrilled with a Christmas gift of 3 glass marbles. The sheer, thoughtless abundance on display here felt like a kind of madness. Through the women's lens, these were not just differences in circumstance. They were data points proving a horrifying equation. Each element of the American Christmas, the food, the heat, the light, the music, was a testament to a nation whose industrial and agricultural might was not only untouched by the war, but was so vast it could afford to spend its surplus on its captured enemies. Inside this crucible of contrast, individual women processed the mounting evidence. Their observations, filtered through their past experiences, began to quantify the impossible. Anneliese, the nurse from Stuttgart, was by nature and training an empiricist. She thought in terms of calories, dosages, and observable symptoms. As the rumors of a feast solidified, she found herself less concerned with the symbolic meaning and more with the nutritional implications. She had spent the last year on the Eastern Front treating soldiers whose wounds were compounded by malnutrition. She knew the sallow skin, the listless eyes, the slow-healing flesh that spoke of profound vitamin and protein deficiency. She had seen children in German cities with the distended bellies of hunger edema. Now she watched a camp cook, a burly American in a white apron, haul a massive tray of dinner rolls from the kitchen. She mentally calculated the ingredients: refined white flour, yeast, probably milk, maybe even eggs. Such things were like gold back home, reserved for the highest party officials or the black market. The meal they were about to be served, she thought, wasn't a celebration. It was a clinical demonstration of metabolic superiority. A younger woman named Geisler, who had worked in a communications bunker near Caen, remained the most resistant. Her mind was a fortress built of propaganda. Americans were decadent, racially mixed, and spiritually hollow. Their strength was a fragile illusion. This feast, she insisted to anyone who would listen, was a performance. They want to make us soft, she whispered to a friend, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. They want us to forget who we are. But her own body was betraying her ideology. The saliva pooled in her mouth against her will. She watched a guard laugh, a hearty, uncomplicated sound, and she felt a pang of something she couldn't name. It was the dissonance of a deeply held belief colliding with undeniable sensory proof. She tried to see the guards as her training had taught her, as brutish gangsters, but all she saw were tired young men, impatient for their own holiday meal, performing a duty. The performance, she was slowly realizing, wasn't in the feast itself. The performance was the ideology she had been clinging to. Then there was Marguerite. A widow in her late 40s, she had been an administrative officer, a woman who understood systems. She saw the world not as a clash of ideals, but as a series of logistical problems to be solved. As she watched the preparations, she wasn't thinking about kindness or cruelty. She was reverse engineering the operation. The sheer number of turkeys, one for every 8 prisoners, she estimated, implied a supply chain of staggering efficiency. It meant refrigerated trucks, coordinated timetables, and massive poultry farms. It meant a national infrastructure that was wholly intact, humming along with a power that was terrifying in its placid confidence. She remembered the desperate reports she had filed in France, pleading for fuel, for ammunition, for spare parts, for food. She remembered the dwindling supplies, the cannibalized vehicles, the unraveling of a system starved of resources. What she was witnessing here wasn't a party. It was a logistics report. It was the other side of the ledger, and the numbers were overwhelming. As one woman later recalled, "We knew of America's industrial power, of course, we were told of it, but it was an abstraction, a number in a speech. The sight of a slice of pumpkin pie on a plate in front of me made it real." It was the proof. Through their eyes, the abstract became terrifyingly concrete. What the women were observing, what they were struggling to comprehend, was the output of a massive, unthinking machine. The architecture that enabled this surreal Christmas feast had little to do with holiday spirit and everything to do with industrial-scale bureaucracy. The phenomenon was underwritten by the Geneva Convention of 1929, a document designed to impose a cold, rational order on the chaos of war. One of its key articles stipulated that prisoners of war must be fed and housed to the same standard as the detaining power's own base echelon troops, defined simply as soldiers stationed in camps, away from the front lines. This single rule set in motion a causal chain that was as logical as it was incredible. The first link in that chain was the United States Army Quartermaster Corps, the logistical behemoth responsible for supplying every American soldier. By 1944, the Quartermaster Corps had perfected the science of feeding millions. It operated on a global scale, with standardized menus, nutritional formulas, and a supply chain that stretched from the farms of the Midwest to the front lines of Europe and the Pacific. For holidays, this system had specific, pre-planned menus. The 1944 Christmas dinner for a U.S. soldier was not left to chance. It was a known quantity, a bill of materials that included turkey, giblet gravy, candied sweet potatoes, assorted pickles, fruit cake, and mince pie. The second link was the convention. The rule was absolute and impersonal. It did not ask if the prisoners deserved a feast. It did not care about their ideology or their role in the war. It simply stated that the standard for the guards was the standard for the prisoners. The American camp commander was not being generous. He was following regulations. To do otherwise, to provide a lesser meal to the German POWs, would have been a violation of international law and a breach of his own military protocol. This created the final, astonishing link in the chain. The German women in Camp Forest were by the transitive property of military logistics entitled to the exact same meal as the American soldiers guarding them. The system functioned like a vast, impartial pipeline. At one end, the immense productivity of the American heartland pumped in resources. At the other, the pipeline terminated in mess halls across the world, dispensing standardized units of sustenance. It was a system blind to the identities of the recipients. It simply registered a mouth to be fed, be it a farm boy from Iowa or a signals operator from Berlin, and delivered the prescribed ration. Marguerite, the administrator, began to see this with a chilling clarity. The feast wasn't a gesture. It was an artifact of process. The Americans weren't being kind. They were simply not programmed to be cruel in this specific way. Their system was built for efficiency and scale, and in this instance, its efficiency produced an outcome that felt like a surreal act of charity. This realization was more devastating than any overt propaganda. The power on display was not the emotional, ideological power the Third Reich celebrated. It was a quiet, systemic power. It was the power of spreadsheets, of railway timetables, of agricultural surplus. It was the power of a nation that could mass-produce not only tanks and planes, but holiday feasts, and distribute them with equal, unblinking efficiency to friend and foe alike. The women were not just prisoners, they were the final item on a very long checklist. The profound dissonance of the Christmas feast was not an isolated event. It was merely the most vivid example of a larger systemic contrast that played out in the daily life of the camp, particularly in the domains of labor and leisure. In Germany, the women had been cogs in a total war economy. Their labor was compulsory, grueling, and often dangerous. A former factory worker among the prisoners remembered her 12-hour shifts assembling radio components, the constant pressure of production quotas, the acrid smell of solder hanging in the air, and the gnawing fear of an Allied bombing raid. Exhaustion was a permanent state. Free time was a fiction. Here in the American camp, the rules were different. Work was voluntary. According to the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be made to work, but female prisoners, like officers, could not. Many chose to, however. They picked cotton in the Tennessee fields or worked in the camp's cannery. The work was monotonous but not brutal. They worked 8-hour days, and crucially, they were paid. The wage was a pittance by American standards, 80 cents a day, paid in camp scrip, a form of currency valid only within the camp's fences. Yet this small sum represented a world of difference. It restored a measure of agency. A woman could use her scrip at the camp canteen to buy a bar of soap, a pack of cigarettes, a Coca-Cola, or a Hershey's chocolate bar. These were not just small luxuries, they were symbols of a consumer economy that, even in wartime, continued to produce non-essential goods. They were items that had vanished from civilian life in Germany years earlier. The very existence of a canteen stocked with such things was another quiet, powerful statement of material superiority. The contrast in leisure was even more stark. In Germany, life outside of work was circumscribed by fear and scarcity. Evenings were spent in darkened apartments or crowded bomb shelters. Here, the evenings were their own. The camp administration, again following a set of protocols aimed at maintaining order and morale, provided resources for recreation. There was a library stocked with German-language books. There were organized sports, with the women forming their own volleyball and handball teams. In some camps, prisoners with academic backgrounds organized and taught university-level courses, from literature to mathematics. One woman, who had been a university student before the war, found herself in a makeshift classroom, listening to a lecture on Goethe, taught by a fellow prisoner who had been a professor in Heidelberg. The quiet normality of it was deeply disorienting. She was a prisoner, thousands of miles from home, yet here she was, continuing her education. This structured provision of leisure inverted the narrative they had been taught. They were supposed to be in the hands of uncultured barbarians. Instead, they were being given access to books, sports, and education. It was all part of the same impersonal system. A well-run camp was a quiet camp. Boredom and idleness were threats to order. Therefore, the regulations called for recreational opportunities. Like the Christmas dinner, it wasn't about kindness. It was about efficient camp management. But for the women experiencing it, the effect was profound. It chipped away at their ideological armor, replacing a worldview of heroic struggle with a daily reality of paid labor, quiet evenings, and the simple, shocking pleasure of reading a novel in peace. This steady accumulation of contradictory evidence created a profound friction, an ideological clash that took place not between guards and prisoners, but within the minds of the women themselves. The entire event of the Christmas feast violated the core assumptions on which their identities were built. The Third Reich's ideology was a stark, romantic narrative of a heroic, racially pure people struggling against a world of inferior, degenerate enemies. The Americans, in particular, were portrayed as a mongrel nation, controlled by Jews, addicted to comfort, and lacking the discipline and spiritual will of the German Volk. This propaganda was the bedrock of their world, and now it was crumbling. The first assumption to fall was that of American weakness. How could a weak, decadent nation project this kind of effortless power? The feast was not the product of a desperate, all-out effort. It felt routine. The guards were not fanatics. They were relaxed, almost bored. The sheer, overwhelming abundance suggested a strength so deep and unbothered that it didn't even need to assert itself. It simply was. Analyzed, the nurse watched the American medics in the camp infirmary. They had seemingly endless supplies of sulfur drugs, penicillin, and clean bandages. They treated German prisoners with the same detached professionalism as they treated American guards. It wasn't compassion, it was protocol. This clinical efficiency was more intimidating than any display of aggression. It spoke of a system that had mastered not just warfare, but welfare, and could deploy both on an industrial scale. The situation also forced a terrifying role inversion. They, the supposed members of the master race, were now the dependent ones, being fed, clothed, and housed by their declared inferiors. The power dynamic was absolute and undeniable. This inversion was felt in small, daily interactions. A young female American lieutenant might give an order to a male sergeant, her authority unquestioned. For the German women, who came from a deeply patriarchal society where a woman's role was circumscribed, seeing a woman in a position of casual command was a small but significant shock. It subtly undermined their own culture's claims of a superior social order. Geisler, the young signals operator, felt this clash most acutely. Her entire sense of self was tied to the national cause. To accept the evidence in front of her, the food, the resources, the quiet confidence of her captors, was to accept that the cause was built on a foundation of lies. The internal monologue was a battle. It's a trick. They are trying to fool us. But her own senses betrayed her. The turkey is real. The gravy is real. The warmth is real. The conflict was paralyzing. If the Americans were not the monsters she had been taught they were, then who were the monsters? If Germany was not the superior nation, then what was the point of the struggle, the sacrifice, the death? How does one reconcile years of indoctrination with the simple, undeniable taste of real pumpkin pie? The feast became a catalyst for a painful re-evaluation. For some, it was a moment of liberation, a first crack in the prison of ideology. For others, it was a source of deep shame and confusion. To accept this food felt like a betrayal. To enjoy it felt like a surrender. But to refuse, it was impossible. The body's needs were more ancient and powerful than any political loyalty. And so they sat, caught between a crumbling worldview and an undeniable reality, the war continuing not on a battlefield, but on the contested ground of their own minds. To understand the scale of this phenomenon, one must look at the cold, hard data of the system. The experiences of the women in Camp Forest were not an anomaly. They were the norm, replicated in hundreds of locations across the United States. The narrative claims are supported by a scaffolding of logistical records, official reports, and demographic facts. First, the sheer numbers. By May 1945, the U.S. held 425,871 enemy prisoners of war. The vast majority were German. They were housed in a network of 155 base camps and 371 branch camps, a sprawling archipelago of confinement that stretched from coast to coast. The female prisoners were a very small minority, numbering only a few hundred, and were held in designated compounds within larger camps like Forest or in separate facilities. This small number made their experience distinct, but the system that governed their lives was the same one managing the hundreds of thousands of men. The food logistics are a case study in American industrial might. Official U.S. Army menus from December 1944 confirm the meal was not an exaggeration. The Type A Christmas menu prescribed for all troops in the continental United States included roast turkey with sage dressing, giblet gravy, snowflake potatoes, buttered asparagus, and mince pie. Quartermaster Corps records show the procurement of millions of pounds of these items. This was not a special purchase. It was a planned surge within a supply chain already accustomed to moving mountains of food. A woman in the camp, a former quartermaster's clerk herself, might have looked at her plate and seen not just a meal, but a ghost of the paperwork she used to file. She could almost picture the requisitions, the shipping manifests, the inventory logs, all functioning with an efficiency she could now only envy. The prisoners themselves, the Helferin and Asterisk, were a specific demographic. They were not, for the most part, ardent Nazi ideologues, but rather young women who had joined the auxiliaries for a variety of reasons: a sense of patriotic duty, a desire for independence, or simply as a better alternative to factory work. Their training was technical, radio operation, cryptography, switchboard management. They were the administrative backbone of a modern army. Analyze the nurse had meticulous memories of the German military's own medical supply system. She remembered the color-coded forms, the constant struggle to account for every bandage, every ampule of morphine. In the Camp Forest infirmary, she once saw an American supply ledger left open on a desk. Her eyes scanned the columns of figures. The quantities of penicillin, of sulfur powder, of plasma, they were astronomical. The numbers in that single ledger told a more complete story of German defeat than any newspaper headline. It confirmed that the war was being lost, not just in terms of tanks and soldiers, but in vials and pills. International Red Cross inspection reports provide further impartial evidence. Delegates regularly visited the camps, and their meticulous reports noted everything from the number of books in the library and the quality of the sanitation to the canteen inventory and the prisoners' health. These reports consistently found that the U.S. was meeting or exceeding the standards of the Geneva Convention. For the women inside, this external validation was invisible. Their evidence was more direct. It was the weight of the wool blanket at night. It was the hot water in the showers. It was the undeniable fact of the Christmas feast on their plates. The moment finally arrived. The women were marched into the mess hall. The long wooden tables were covered with paper cloths. The air was thick with the smells that had tormented them for hours. In the center of each table sat plates of pickles, bowls of bread, and pitchers of milk. It was a scene of such prosaic abundance that it felt hallucinatory. As the American cooks, aided by prisoner volunteers, began to serve the food, a heavy silence fell over the room. They moved down the line, their plates being loaded with scoops of white potatoes, a slice of dark meat, a slice of white, a ladle of gravy, a spoonful of bright red cranberry sauce. The physical weight of the plate was surprising. It had been years since a meal had felt so substantial. A woman's hand trembled as she took her plate. She sat down, staring at the food. Her body, conditioned by years of scarcity, was sending contradictory signals. Her stomach cramped with the fierce pangs of hunger, yet her mind recoiled. This was the food of the enemy. To eat it felt like an act of profound complicity. Another woman, a young Berliner, took her first bite of turkey. The rich, savory flavor filled her mouth, and her eyes instantly filled with tears. The taste did not evoke joy. It evoked an image of her younger siblings, their thin faces, their patched clothes. The thought of them eating their meager Christmas ration of boiled potatoes and a sliver of blood sausage While she sat here eating this, the guilt was a physical presence, a stone in her stomach. The food turned to ash in her mouth. She put her fork down, unable to continue. The psychological cost of this gift was immense. It was a direct assault on their sense of loyalty, their memory, their identity. Geisler, the ideologue, felt her carefully constructed world dissolving. With each bite, the propaganda slogans that had sustained her seemed more hollow, more absurd. The foundation of her belief was not being destroyed by an argument, it was being digested. The feeling was terrifying. It was a kind of internal annihilation, leaving a void where certainty used to be. Don't eat too fast. The whispered advice passed between the women. Their digestive systems, long accustomed to a low-calorie, low-fat diet, would rebel against this sudden onslaught of richness. Some women would be sick later. Analyze, the nurse watched this all with a clinician's detachment. She saw the trembling hands, the tears, the mixture of ravenous hunger and deep-seated shame on the faces around her. She was witnessing a mass psychological event, a case of collective cognitive dissonance induced by protein and fat. In the midst of the low din of clinking forks and quiet murmurs, there was a moment of absolute stillness. A woman in her 50s, a mother of 3 grown sons, all on the front, sat staring at her plate. She had not touched her food. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek, dripping from her chin onto the table. She didn't wipe it away. In that quiet, private moment of grief, the entire paradox of their situation was contained. They were not being starved. They were not being beaten. They were being defeated by a kindness so vast, so impersonal, so utterly incomprehensible, that it was more disorienting than any cruelty. For Marguerite, the administrator, the moment of revelation came with the pie. It was a perfect wedge of pumpkin pie, topped with a dollop of what looked and tasted like real whipped cream. The mathematical impossibility of it all finally crashed down upon her. It was not an act of kindness. It was not a gesture of propaganda. The Christmas feast was an accidental byproduct of a system, an inevitable consequence of industrial-scale bureaucracy executing a rulebook. That was the turn. The perspective shift that reinterpreted everything she had seen. The Americans were not being good people. They were being efficient administrators. Their power was not located in their morality or their ideals. It was located in their logistics. It was the power of the quartermaster corps, of the factory, of the farm. The most potent weapon in the American arsenal, she suddenly understood, was not the Sherman tank or the flying fortress. It was the country's terrifying, inexhaustible ability to produce and distribute surplus. It was a victory of process. The implications of this insight unfolded with devastating speed. First, it meant that the entire German narrative of a heroic struggle against a decadent foe was a lie. The enemy wasn't decadent, it was organized. Its decadence was merely a surface-level symptom of an underlying productive capacity so vast that it could sustain a global war and still provide its soldiers, and its prisoners, with pie. Second, it meant that the war had been lost long before the first shot was fired. It was not being lost on the battlefields of Russia or the beaches of Normandy. It had been lost in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the stockyards of Chicago, and the wheat fields of Kansas. Germany's war effort was a desperate gamble, fueled by conquest and ideology. America's was a vast, humming enterprise, fueled by its own internal organic power. Finally, it reframed her own captivity. She was not a noble prisoner of a worthy adversary. She was a line item on a budget sheet, a statistical unit in a flawlessly functioning system of containment. There was no glory in it, no tragedy, just the cold, hard math of unequal power. She looked around the mess hall at the other women. She saw their confusion, their guilt, their tears. They were reacting to the feast on a human, emotional level, but they were missing the point. The point wasn't the food. The point was the system that delivered it. In that moment, looking at a simple slice of pie, Marguerite knew with an absolute, soul-crushing certainty that Germany had lost the war. It was not a premonition or a fear. It was a conclusion, arrived at by a simple, brutal calculation of inputs and outputs. The war would continue for 5 more months, but for her, it was already over. The synthesis emerges when the human-scale moment is connected to the system-scale meaning. The quiet, personal crisis a woman experienced over a piece of turkey in Tennessee was a direct and predictable outcome of global economic and political realities. The chain of causality is clear. A continent away, the American industrial base, physically untouched by the war, was operating at peak capacity, creating a mountain of surplus. This material advantage was channeled by the U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps, a vast organization designed to distribute resources according to standardized regulations. Those regulations, in turn, were bound by the International Treaty of the Geneva Convention, which applied the same material standards to prisoners of war as to the Army's own rear echelon troops. The final link in this long, impersonal chain was the German woman in the camp, whose entire worldview was shattered by the material evidence on her dinner plate. This experience reveals a durable takeaway about the nature of modern power. It suggests that systems, once established, can produce outcomes entirely divorced from the intentions or emotions of the individuals within them. The camp commander may have felt no particular kindness toward his prisoners, yet the system he administered compelled an act that appeared, on the surface, to be deeply benevolent. This banality of abundance proved to be a more effective psychological weapon than overt cruelty. It did not create resistance. It created a profound and disorienting confusion, forcing the prisoners to question the very foundations of their beliefs. It tends to show that the true measure of a nation's power in total war is not just its military prowess, but its logistical resilience, its administrative capacity, and its ability to generate surplus. The dinner plate became a more accurate gauge of the global balance of power than a battlefield report. For the women, this understanding was not an abstract geopolitical lesson. It was a lived reality. They had been participants in a system, the German war machine, that was ultimately brittle, running on finite resources and ideological fervor. Now they were captives within a system that was flexible, resilient, and fueled by a seemingly infinite material base. Trying to reconcile these two realities was the central struggle of their captivity. A woman writing a letter home would find it impossible to explain. How do you describe a system? How do you articulate the quiet, soul-crushing power of a well-stocked canteen? She could write about the work, the food, the barracks, but she could not convey the deeper truth, that she was being defeated not by soldiers, but by an assembly line. She was a prisoner of a spreadsheet, a captive of a reality she had never been taught to see. The scent of roasting turkey and cinnamon on the cold Tennessee air. For the woman who first smelled it, it was an impossible anomaly, a sensory ghost from a forgotten world. Now she understood it was the scent of a different kind of power. Not the power of bombs and bullets, but the quiet, relentless power of a system that could produce, deliver, and distribute, even to its enemies, a feast in the middle of a world at war. For these women, the rules of war produced a reality stranger than any fiction. Notice what changes when you stop looking for malice or kindness and start looking for the system. They were not just prisoners of an army, they were witnesses to a machine, and the questions it raised would follow them long after they returned to the ruins of their homeland. Their war ended not with a bang, but with the quiet clink of a fork on a plate, a moment of surrender not to a soldier, but to an undeniable truth. If a system of rules could accidentally create a feast in the midst of war, what happens when a system is designed, with cold precision, to create a famine? The story continues. Subscribe to see what comes next.